looking a little bit more forward to the medium term, call it the next 3 years, I do believe that some of these economic recovery-driven infrastructure projects will help hold prices higher for longer. I think one of the big events for people to watch is what happens in the U.S. elections in November. It was speculated this past summer that current President Trump was going to announce a $1 trillion economic stimulus package geared towards infrastructure spending. But quite interestingly, his main rival, Biden, is talking about a $2 trillion infrastructure program. So post that November election, I think it will be really important to see whether one of these announcements does come out, because of course that would entail quite a bit of steel consumption and therefore support iron ore prices. I think one of the also things to watch out for is whether there truly is a second COVID wave, because that will impact the pace of economic recovery and therefore steel demand. With more people working from home these days, it's not as likely that they're going to need a second car or an office in the central business district, which does impact to an extent steel demand. And we also have Brexit as a bit of a wild card, which could impact steel consumption, in particular because of some of the uncertainty it creates around trade for items such as cars, which could have duties as high as 10%. Longer term, I think globally, as I mentioned, we are seeing a shift away from sinter and towards greater consumption of pellets, and therefore the need for pellet feed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And this will bode well for companies that are focused in that area. In terms of Australian direct shipping ore, which is again largely consumed of fines and lumps, one of the other things to watch out for is the levels of phosphorus and alumina in that ore, which makes steel more brittle. And again, does shift the need to source material from other countries that could be lower in those materials.
So now we move on to the particular things about prices. After all the overall environment and everything, if you're looking at the prices, it's very interesting. I should have put steel prices in comparison. You will be able to tell the sharp contrast. Since the beginning of the year, with or without COVID-19, the iron ore prices have been rather resilient in comparison with China steel prices. Everyone may be looking at China steel market performing well, but if you do the year-on-year comparison, you will notice that China's domestic steel prices, whichever product you are talking about, rebar, HRC, the prices are still 200 to 300 or even more below last year's level. Whereas if you look at iron ore, basically even reach a multi-year high sometime in late August, early September. So that is rather phenomenal, especially if your end users are now doing well. There is rather phenomenal to see that the raw material has been skyrocketing. I call it skyrocketing because under the circumstances, basically it's barreling up all the way. It's only recently, for the past couple of days or week also, we saw the prices coming down quite substantially. Now we are looking at $115 CFR, pretty much. So it's at $15, but still it was above the $100 benchmark. I think the reason of the decline has to do with China steel prices already at a rather low level come down again. That's why, dragging the iron ore prices down together.
Moving on to rest of the world, right? So we've got, obviously China has roared out of this and had, some could say, a gluttonous appetite for Fe units. The bids for the high grade product's been great. I mean, we saw coming out of the pandemic, we saw bids for low grade product, the 58 product out of Australia, low grade, and the high grade, both getting bid up significantly right across the spectrum. It just seemed like there was this black hole of consumption of Fe units. But what was left behind, and we saw this with major producers, having to redirect rest of the world. So Japan destined cargo, Korea destined cargo, Southeast Asia destined, Middle East and Europe was all finding a home in China. Now with this price setting back here, both from a 62 perspective, but also from a high grade, because a lot of those other markets are after the high grade Fe units, particularly the Middle East for pelletization. Europe likes to have a high grade product as well. Obviously, it's more environmentally friendly to work with a high-grade product because we're shipping more Fe units on every vessel that goes of the same size. Could you just talk us a little bit through, Matt, where you see the rest of the world going, and can they pick up the slack? So as China demand might be waning a little bit, price coming off, is the rest of the world coming back to pick up the slack?
In terms of the rest of the world, it is still quite concerning with the COVID rates, especially in Europe, starting to climb up again. It did look like about 2 months ago that Europe was starting to reduce quite a bit of the lockdowns, and we did see quite a bit of economic recovery. But I think people are taking a bit of a pause right now and are quite concerned on what the rest of the year is going to look like. As mentioned during my talk, I think the real big driver outside of China to watch for is going to be some policy announcements in the United States, particularly around economic stimulus geared towards infrastructure spending, which is going to entail massive construction of roads, power lines, bridges, 5G networks, and that is projects that are going to take multiple years to complete. There are things that are not just to stimulate the economy, but there are also things that are actually required in the US because a lot of the infrastructure was constructed through the 60s and 70s and in many cases not upgraded or touched since. And the nice thing with infrastructure is that it also entails quite a bit of employment. So this solves a number of different problems for the US. It's not just the US, also in other countries to the benefit of steel and ultimately iron ore.
I'm just going to go to one of the questions we've got here. We've got a few now coming in, which is great, good engagement. So the first question I'm going to give to too is, with the supply shrinkage from Brazil and increasing raw material prices, will there be a surge in iron ore mining in China as prices above $80 per metric ton supports the iron ore mining from Chinese players? So domestic supply in China. And I suppose it's always been a hard one to grapple with exactly. I remember all the S&Ds I used to do too, trying to triangulate what that's going to be out of China, particularly when it comes to grades, etc. And I suppose this is going back to that conversation we had around concentrates in China and discount to the 65. So Hong Mei, what's your thoughts there, please?
I think, first of all, I think it's a very good question. I think the person definitely closely monitoring the market, because $80 we mentioned, I think the market there's a kind of a common understanding saying that $80 and above, domestic iron ore minings will be able to survive, but only so much. New investment, it will be hard to come by because, as I mentioned, wherever you can dig out from the open pit, from the shallow depths, you're already done. So what you're going to do, you go to underground. And in China, we're not talking about 200 meters below the ground. We're talking about 1,000 meters as deep as below the ground. It's not economical. And also, the mining operations will be different. Shallow depths and open pit, you can use human power and a lot of human resources, even though, the human resources cost is on the rise, but compared with, the first one-off investment is still more affordable to some extent. But underground is serious stuff. Safety issues, automation, you all need to take on consideration. And nowadays, because inflation, everything in fixed asset investment will be far more expensive than many years ago. So $80 will only enable some of the Chinese iron ore mining options to resume some of the idled mines, but the number as well as the capacity will be limited. Degrading issues. One of the things you do need to consider is degrading issues. You're looking at the numbers, in China got a run of mine iron ore output, and we do the concentrate output. You do the comparison, you will realize nowadays a lot of mining operations using 5 tons of ROM ore to produce concentrate. So the cost definitely is really very high. I don't think in the future. So that's why I mentioned single digit growth. Yes, could be. Double digit, it will be very hard to come by in China. Yeah, thank you.